My hope, my prayer, is that you realize the significance of that song before this series is over. Because of the fact that we go literally from glory to glory. Am I on? This thing on? Okay. We literally go from glory to glory. What that means is we go from blessing to blessing. We go from God providing to God providing. When we step out of a time in our lives where God was at work, we step into another place where God is working and moving again. We're never outside of the glory of God. We literally are in the midst of it every time we turn around. But so many times we take it all for granted. We don't even think about it. We don't even think about the presence of God and what He's done in our lives. We kind of put that on the back burner, and we forget that God is literally always working and moving in our lives. So we start this series called Man, Myth, Messiah. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at what do we believe? Why do we believe it? You know, who is this Jesus guy? Was he just a man? Was he actually a Messiah? It's okay to have questions. You know, one of the places that it should be the most comfortable questioning things is in the church. But so many times it's looked on as a bad thing if you have a question or a doubt about God and faith. But see, this should be the most welcoming place to have those questions, because hopefully we realize we have the answers to those things. But you see, one of the things that I'm finding out is that a lot of people believe in God, but if you ask them why, or if you ask them to show me the evidence of your faith, they can't do it. How many times have you ever convinced someone of something by saying, I don't know, just because? Well, it's not going to happen with faith either. You're not going to convince someone that Jesus Christ was the Messiah simply by saying, well, that's always what I've been taught. They want to know the evidence. So I'm going to give you the evidence, but I'm going to do it from a perspective of I'm not just going to give you the evidence, I'm going to show you the other side. I'm also going to come from a perspective of sharing with you the skeptics and what they believe and what they think. And hopefully, by the end of this, you'll come out of this being able to defend your faith and what you believe and why you believe it. So I want us to look at the evidence. And really what you guys are going to do is you are literally taking on the role of detective. Because we're literally going to investigate our faith. Evidence is broken down into two broad categories. The first one is direct evidence. These are the eyewitness testimonies. This is evidence that can be proved, that can prove something all by itself. Eyewitness testimonies. And the next one is indirect evidence. This doesn't prove all by itself, but what it does is it points you in the right direction. So this is what they call as circumstantial evidence. But circumstantial evidence is a good thing. A lot of times you hear people, if you ever watch crime dramas and you hear someone say circumstantial evidence that's not valuable, it is very valuable. Because if you actually look at research and crimes and how the cases are solved, 85% of cases, especially murder cases, are solved using indirect evidence because they don't have eyewitnesses all the time. And so they have to follow the evidence and where it's pointing, and they have to be able to make a case based off of that evidence. So 85% of circumstantial evidence cases are used in closing cases. So let me give you an example of direct and indirect evidence. An example for direct evidence would be if you came in from outside and you came into this room and you said, "It's raining outside." You literally were outside, it rained on you, you felt the rain, you walked in, you told us, firsthand account, it was raining. Indirect evidence. If you were sitting in this room and you said, "I think it's raining because the person who just came in the room was wearing a raincoat and it had water splashed all over it. Therefore, it's raining outside." You don't know that for a fact, because the sprinkler system could have just went crazy. But the evidence leads you to believe that it's a possibility that it's raining outside. So as we look at evidence for the Gospels and for Jesus Christ, I want you to think about those things. Jesus said in John chapter 8, verse 32, he said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." That it's the truth that sets a person free. And so what I want us to do is I want us to look and find truth today. Skepticism isn't anything really new, but in the 17th and 18th century, it became something that really kind of took over culture. The time was actually called the Age of Enlightenment, because they were all about what is the truth, what is the evidence that is out there. It became popular that more theories other than God had become more popular than just simply religion being the answer. Atheist Michael Shermer said this. He said, "Religious faith depends on a host of social, psychological, and emotional factors that have little or nothing to do with probabilities, evidence, and logic." He was saying that there was no evidence whatsoever to prove why we need to be religious and have faith. That it was all just an emotional or psychological thing that was taught to us over time. Believe it or not, Christianity is the only religion that stands or falls based on supposed historical evidence. It's all about the evidence to prove the case. But it's the only religion that gives you the ability to prove its validity based on evidence. So as detectives, one of the important things for you to do is to realize first the chain of custody of the evidence. And so before we can even look at Jesus, and was he man or Messiah, was he a myth, we first have to look at the accounts of this person named Jesus, which we know them as the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The question has been raised by the skeptics: do we have what was originally written when the original authors wrote it, or has it been changed over time? One of the main stumbling blocks for skeptics is, were the Gospels copied from the originals, or were they written by other authors or rewritten later? They found that this actually is kind of baseless, because they're saying, well, if it's not, it's a copy of a manuscript, so therefore it's not the original, so therefore we can't know for sure whether it's the truth or not. Well, the thing is that has a baseless argument, because all of ancient manuscripts were written on papyrus, which after a few hundred years deteriorated. And so unless it was chiseled in stone, there's no 100% on any of them. But yet the one that takes the most scrutiny is the Bible. We don't question Socrates or Plato. or Aristotle, we teach them. But if we teach Christianity, not even Christianity, but if we teach about an historical Jesus, we get in trouble. But why? Because as we'll find out, there's more evidence for Jesus than anyone else. The New Testament. We have over 5,800 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. In comparison to existing manuscript copies of other ancient texts, both from Greek and Latin authors such as Plato, Aristotle, Caesar, and Tacitus, who was a church historian, or he was just a historian at that time. The number of copies that we have range from 1 to 20. New Testament, we have 5,800. You see a problem with that? The next closest one to the New Testament is Homer's Iliad. Anybody read that in school? I hope you didn't, because you just lost about half your life if you did. We only have 1,757 copies. That's the next closest one. We can teach one, we can't teach the other. Is there a historical problem with that? Skeptics, another thing, it says, well, the time span is too far, it's too distant, so therefore we can't account for whether the Gospels were true or not. Okay, so let's look at this. The Iliad, Homer's Iliad. The time span between the original writing and its first discovered copy of Homer's Iliad was 350 to 400 years is the difference. The New Testament is 50 to 300 years. We have copies going back farther to the original for the New Testament, but it's the New Testament that we question in its validity as being historical evidence. The number of transcripts that they have, New Testament scholars can accurately reconstruct from the originals with a 99% accuracy. No other ancient document can they even come any close to that percentage. Historians use reliable criteria to establish the probability that an event actually happened. One of those criteria are claims are more likely to be true if they are reported by multiple independent sources. Scholars have discovered more literary sources for the historical Jesus within the first 100 years after his life than all of the primary literary sources for Socrates. Which, ironically, the sources that they have for Socrates actually do not agree with each other. But the sources we have for the New Testament does. So looking a little closer at these specific Gospels. A gospel writer, and what they did was they wrote on the authoritative compilation of Jesus' style of life and his ministry and the teachings. But it wasn't just a day-to-day account, like a biography. It was literally, they took all of the important things and they put it into the story or gospel of Jesus. So the book of Mark was actually the first gospel that was written. It was written between 60 and 70 AD. This is the same John Mark that we read about in other books, and he was a companion of Peter. He was a cousin of Barnabas, and he traveled with Paul. One church historian said this. He said, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said and done by Christ. So he wasn't necessarily an eyewitness, but he was very close friends and associates with Peter, who literally was right there with everything that Jesus did. He traveled with Paul. with Peter. The writing style suggests that the author knew Aramaic, which was the common language at that time in Israel. It mentions Peter the most frequently than all of the other Gospels. Well, it just so happens that Mark was the traveling companion with Peter. It's actually written from the perspective of one of the disciples. Well, he couldn't have written it from that perspective if he didn't know one of the disciples. The next book we have is Matthew. It's the second book that was written, and it's between the late 70s and the 80s. And just let me verify real quickly because I don't want to make any confusion about this. When I say 70s and 80s, I'm not talking about 1970 and 1980. I'm talking about 70, literally the year 70 and AD. Okay, hopefully we got that clear. Papias, who was also a church historian, said, "So then Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew language, and everyone interpreted them as he was able." It just so happens that Matthew was a Levite, and he was a tax collector. Guess what language he spoke? Because he was a Hebrew, and he was originally written in the Hebrew language. Luke was a physician. He was also one of Paul's traveling companions. The internal evidence within the book states that he wrote the Gospel and the book of Acts. So Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, and he wrote them in the 70s. Luke actually paraphrases, and this one of the evidences that we have that we know that Mark was one of the first writers was because we find a lot of the prophecies that Mark uses are actually found in other Gospels. So they literally used the teachings of some of the first Gospels to educate themselves on what the other people knew. Because if you think about it, this culture was not I'm going to write this down in my journal today because this was really cool culture. It was, I have a cool story to tell, and so I'm orally going to tell you. So everything prior to the Gospels being written down was just told to other people orally. So we eventually came to a point where we had the Gospels in manuscript form. The Gospel of John, which was the final Gospel that was written, he mentions himself as an eyewitness and one of the original 12 disciples. So he was literally one of Jesus' disciples. So he knew exactly the teachings of Jesus and what he had lived. It was written towards the end of the first century. These are the 4 Gospels that have been accepted by the early church as being the official canonical historical documents that are in the Bible. What we have in the Bible, we call it the canon. This is a whole bunch of church history you probably don't care anything about, but it's the canon. You may say, well, weren't there other documents that were written that were historical documents? Why aren't they in here? We'll talk about one in a little bit because it's the most popular one right now, the Gospel of Thomas. Why is not that in here? Well, they had to fulfill certain criteria to be able to be at part of the canon. And here's this threefold criteria. They had to be eyewitnesses of Jesus or close associates of those who were. They had to be recognized very early as authoritative in all regions of the Christian world. And they had to conform to the teachings that went directly back to the apostles. The apostles are the original 12 disciples. So all of the teaching had to go back and had to conform to what they had taught. So those were the 3 criteria. The only 4 Gospels that meet that criteria were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The early church fathers quoted these Gospels so much that we can literally take the early church fathers and their writings and we can rewrite the four Gospels just on the quotes of the early church fathers. We cannot do that with the books that were written that are not in the Bible. So the Gospel of Thomas. What it was, it's pretty much a simple collection of sayings that are partially derived from the canonical Gospels. None of its other content can be verified historically or archaeologically. And it was likely written in the mid-2nd century, so a whole century after the last Gospel was written. The most striking thing about it is that most of the teachings in it are completely at odds with everything else about we know. It's at odds with everything that we know historically about Jesus. So guess which book the skeptics are angry about that's not in our Bible? That's the first book they go to. Why isn't the Gospel of Thomas in there? Because it's not historically accurate. It contradicts everything that the rest of the Bible says. Why would we put something in there that's totally contradictory and cannot be verified historically or archaeologically? Why would we do that? One of the things that we use when we look at the Gospels is the embarrassing testimony. How many of you, if you were writing a book about yourself, would leave out all of the embarrassing things that you did in college? Majority of us, right? We're going to leave that out. We don't want to leave that in there. So why would they leave in there the fact that they denied Jesus? Why would they leave it in there that they asked to be on Jesus' right and left and he shut them down cold? Why would Peter be quoted when all he did was constantly put his foot in his mouth? It makes them look bad, so why would they have added that in there? One author said this. He said, if men were the sole authors of the gospel, they would have made themselves look a whole lot better. But they weren't. Skeptics consider the differences between the Gospels as contradictions or errors, and so therefore they're unreliable because there's differences in them. Ironically, the differences in the Gospel accounts actually support the historical reliability of these documents. A book that I suggest and recommend for you is it's called Cold Case Christianity. It's by J. Warner Wallace. He's actually a cold case detective in L.A., and he was an atheist when he set out on this journey to examine the evidence of the Gospels based on how he would examine evidence of a cold case. So as he looked at this evidence, his conclusion was he examined the number of similarities and differences perfectly match what would be expected if the basic story were true. In addition, the facts made no sense if the stories were fabricated. So going by just the simple standards of a criminal investigation and applying that to the Gospels, he's saying no court should ever rule against these documents being historically accurate. So what about the contradictions? Because hopefully, if you've read the Gospels and you read through them, you'll realize, one, that the authors write differently. And so there tends to be places where you're reading and it's like, well, Matthew just said it that way. Now, why'd Luke say it totally different? Well, here's why. All 4 Gospels were written for 4 different audiences. They were written for 4 different audiences. Let me give you an example of how this works. When we had a second service here, I literally wrote one message for the first service, and I rewrote the message for the first service for the second service audience. So I literally wrote 2 messages. Why did I do that? Because the age demographic was totally different. I put in slang. I don't use a whole lot of slang. I know I use some, but I don't use a whole lot of slang. Because the younger generations understand that. Sorry, you guys don't always get my humor. Some of you are questioning whether I have humor or not. Yeah. And Jennifer tells me I don't. So Matthew, he wrote speaking to the Jews and the deeply religious people of that time. That was his audience that he wrote to. Mark, he speaks to the Romans and the leadership of the day. Luke, he spoke to the Greeks. John, he wrote for literally the widest audience possible. They all 4 wrote for different audiences. And so they used words differently, but literally saying the same things. Now let me ask you this. Can we say the same thing but word it differently today? For those of you who don't know, the answer is yes, we can. We can word things differently. One of the biggest evidences for the Gospels and for really the Bible itself is every single piece of evidence, historically and otherwise, in the Bible can be archaeologically backed up. So every place that they say they were at literally happened. A lot of times when they say that they went up to Jerusalem, geographically, a skeptic looks at that and says, oh, well, they messed up. They're wrong because they didn't go up to go to Jerusalem. They actually went down from where they were. But the reality is, the elevation of Jerusalem was up. And so they wrote from, I'm down here and I'm going up to Jerusalem. They weren't thinking about a map. They were thinking about the elevation. And so we have to think about those things archaeologically. We have them. If you want to ever hear some really great stories, if you ever come across this man named Wilbur Williams, chain him down somewhere and pick his mind. I'm pretty sure he's in his 90s now, and he's still one of the most brilliant men I have ever met. He knows everything, literally everything you can think of from the Old Testament. He has been to Israel like over 100 times, and he was actually helped on one of the archaeological digs that helped find artifacts going back to Abraham. And I mean, he's phenomenal. He teaches at Indiana Wesleyan. If you ever go back to school, just avoid his Old Testament class because it is hard. Real quick. This is my little rant. I had been a Christian for 6 months. Second semester, I took Old Testament with Wilbur Williams. His tests are so hard, he grades on a curve. So whoever has the highest grade, that's the A. Could someone have told me that the girl sitting behind me had a photographic memory? She literally got 100% on all her tests, and so we're all stuck with D's and F's because this girl behind me. Sorry, that's my little rant. But literally, historically accurate document. And here's what I don't want you to do. I don't want you to leave here and say, you know what, my pastor said today that the Bible is the most historical document, and now that is the basis for your evidence to someone's faith. Because it won't work. I want you to investigate it yourself. I want you to look into it. I want you to find the answers. I want you to investigate why you believe what you believe. But here's one of the things that I want to give you a little warning about. If you find yourself saying, you know, not all my questions have answers. All my questions haven't been answered. Here's the thing you need to remember. Get over it. Because not every question you have will have an answer. Not every question you have will have an answer. What you really need to ask yourself is, are my questions deal breakers if I don't have an answer? Are my questions deal breakers if I don't have an answer? You see, because in any case, the basis for the case is beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond a possible doubt. Because we can be skeptical about anything. And we can have all the answers we want in the world and still be a skeptic if we want. We can still deny the historical accuracy of the Bible if we choose to. But I promise you, if you do the research yourself, and don't just depend on me to give you everything, because there's a whole wealth of information out there that I didn't even touch with you today. But here's another fair warning, what I don't want you to do. Do not go home and Google it. Do not Google it. I asked my dad a plumbing question this week. I made the mistake of getting him an iPhone a few months ago. He texted me back and he said, I don't know, Google it. I'm like, you're my dad, you're supposed to know this. I'm not Googling it. Don't Google it. There's way too much CRAP online that is just someone spouting off their opinions. And usually those are the first page of results you get when you Google. So if you don't know 100% what you're looking for, Google's dangerous. Stay away from it. But if you want books that will not just say 100%, this is all the evidence for Christianity, but if you want books that will look at, these are what the skeptics are saying, and this is what Christianity says, come to me. I've got plenty of them. That's my challenge to you. Because here's the thing. The answer to man, myth, Messiah ultimately can only be made by you. It's not about me convincing you. It's about you looking at the evidence and saying, is it true or is it not? I may have a little biased opinion, but it's there. Look into it. Because here's the thing. If you can't defend your faith, you need to ask yourself why. I'm not saying you have all the answers, because none of us have all the answers. But if you can't form a foundation of what you believe and why you believe it, ask yourself why you believe it in the first place. Because mama told me so doesn't work. You're not living your mom's faith. You need to be living your faith.